Summer, 1925. A stuffy, sweltering courtroom in the tiny town of Dayton, Tennessee. The eyes of the nation are glued to a legal drama for the ages. On one side, a young science teacher, accused of the crime of teaching evolution. On the other, the full force of religious tradition. It's the trial of the century, a titanic courtroom showdown between two of America's greatest lawyers. Science versus faith. Reason versus revelation. The modern world versus the old-time religion. This is the Scopes monkey trial. The story is legendary. It's been turned into plays and movies, and it has cemented itself in the American mind as the moment science put religion on trial and won. But what if that story is a myth? What if the trial was never really about the guilt or innocence of one teacher? What if the whole thing was a publicity stunt? A staged event designed to put a town on the map? And what if the famous battle between evolution and creationism was just a proxy war for a much larger, deeper conflict that was tearing America apart? Today, we are putting the myth itself on trial. We'll uncover the hidden story of the Scopes trial and reveal what the famous monkey trial was really about. And the answer is a lot more complicated and a lot more relevant to our world today than you think. To understand the explosion in Dayton, Tennessee, you have to understand the powder keg that was 1922's America. The Roaring Twenties was an era of dizzying, disorienting change. For the first time in American history, more people lived in cities than in the countryside. The cities were the epicenters of modern life. Skyscrapers, jazz clubs, automobiles, movie palaces, and new ideas. They were diverse, secular, and fast-paced. But rural America felt like a different country. It was the America of the small town, the farm, and the church. Life was slower, more traditional, and deeply rooted in a Protestant Christian faith that was seen as the bedrock of the nation. And many in rural America looked at the cities with deep suspicion. They saw them as cesspools of moral decay, full of immigrants, godless intellectuals, and loose morals. This anxiety gave birth to a powerful counter-movement: Christian fundamentalism. Fundamentalism was a direct response to the modern world. It rejected the new higher criticism that analyzed the Bible as a historical text. Instead, it insisted on the fundamentals of the faith: the literal, word-for-word truth of the Bible, the virgin birth of Jesus and his physical resurrection, and the ultimate symbol of threatening, godless, big city science: Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. For fundamentalists, evolution wasn't just a scientific theory. It was a direct assault on the biblical story of creation, and by extension, on the entire moral order. They believed it demoted humanity from God's special creation to just another animal, and that this would lead to social decay and chaos. So, they launched a political campaign to ban it from public schools. In March of 1925, they succeeded in Tennessee with the passage of the Butler Act, making it illegal to teach that man descended from a lower order of animals. No, with the law in place, you need a court case. And this is where the story gets strange. The Scopes trial wasn't the result of some eagle-eyed prosecutor catching a teacher in the act. The whole thing was to get the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, saw the Butler Act as a violation of free speech. They put out an ad in Tennessee newspapers, offering to fund the legal defense of any teacher willing to challenge the law. Meanwhile, in the struggling town of Dayton, Tennessee, a group of local businessmen were sitting around a table in a drugstore. They read the ACLU's ad and had an idea. A trial would be a huge event. It would bring in reporters, tourists, and money. It could put Dayton on the map. So, they hatched a plan. They needed a defendant. They called in a 24-year-old high school football coach and substitute science teacher named John T. Scopes. They asked him, "Did you teach evolution?" Scopes was hesitant. He couldn't even remember if he had. He'd just been filling in, using the state-mandated textbook, which included a chapter on evolution. That was good enough for them. He agreed to be their defendant. They swore out a warrant for his arrest right there in the drugstore, and the stage was set for a show. But a show needs superstars, and it got two of the biggest figures in American life. To lead the prosecution, the fundamentalists brought in a living legend, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan was a three-time Democratic nominee for president, a former Secretary of State, and a populist hero. He was a man of deep faith, the voice of rural, Christian America. For him, this was a holy crusade. To lead the defense, the ACLU recruited the most famous and feared lawyer in the country, Clarence Darrow. Darrow was the opposite of Bryan in every way. He was a big city intellectual, a famous agnostic, and a staunch defender of the underdog. For him, this was a battle for intellectual freedom against religious bigotry. The moment Bryan and Darrow signed on, the trial of John Scopes was no longer about a substitute teacher in a small town. It was a symbolic clash of civilizations. It was Bryan versus Darrow, rural versus urban, tradition versus modernism. It was a battle for the very soul of America. The trial began in July 1925, and Dayton, Tennessee, turned into a circus. Reporters from over 200 newspapers flocked to the town. It was the first American trial to be broadcast live on the radio. Street preachers stood on corners, shouting about hellfire and damnation. Souvenir stands sold toy monkeys. One hotel even brought in a live chimpanzee and dressed it in a little suit. Inside the courtroom, it was so hot that the judge and lawyers eventually moved the proceedings outside onto the courthouse lawn. Legally, the case was simple. Scopes admitted to teaching from the textbook. He had clearly broken the law, but Darrow didn't care about the legal case. His goal was to put fundamentalism itself on trial in the court of public opinion, and he did it with a move of breathtaking legal audacity, knowing he couldn't win on the facts of the case. Darrow called the leader of the prosecution, William Jennings Bryan, to the witness stand. As an expert on the Bible, what followed was one of the most dramatic and surreal exchanges in legal history. For 2 hours, under the blazing Tennessee sun, Darrow grilled Bryan on his literal interpretation of Scripture. Darrow asked, "Was the great flood of Noah a literal event?" Bryan said, "Yes." Darrow asked, "Do you believe the earth was created in 6 literal, 24-hour days?" Bryan, sensing a trap, conceded that the days of creation might have been longer periods of time, a major concession for a literalist. Darrow pressed on. "What about Jonah being swallowed by a whale? The sun standing still for Joshua? Where did Cain get his wife?" The crowd of Tennesseans cheered for Bryan, their hero. But the national press, watching Darrow relentlessly expose the apparent contradictions and scientific impossibilities in a literalist reading of the Bible, were mesmerized. They portrayed Bryan as a buffoon, a foolish old man clinging to an outdated faith. Darrow was making Bryan, and by extension, all of fundamentalism, look ridiculous on a national stage. In the end, the verdict was almost an afterthought. The judge ultimately expunged Bryan's testimony from the record. Darrow, having made his point, asked the jury to find his own client guilty so they could appeal the case. They did. John Scopes was convicted and fined $100. It was a victory for the prosecution, but it was a hollow one. The Tennessee Supreme Court later threw out the conviction on a technicality, so the law was never tested in a higher federal court. Tragically, William Jennings Bryan, exhausted and humiliated by the trial, died in his sleep in Dayton just 5 days after the trial ended. So who won? In the short term, the fundamentalists won the legal battle. The Butler Act remained law in Tennessee for another 40 years. And other states passed similar anti-evolution laws. Textbook publishers, scared of controversy, began removing evolution from their books. But in the long term, they suffered a devastating loss in the public relations war. The national media, led by the sharp-tongued journalist Hull Mencken, who dubbed it the monkey trial, painted a brutal picture of rural Christians as ignorant, backward yokels. The trial made fundamentalism a punchline in sophisticated, urban America. The Scopes trial was never really about a monkey, or a man named Scopes, or even the theory of evolution. It was a spectacle. It was a cultural flashpoint that exposed the deep anxieties of a nation caught between its rural, religious past, and its urban, secular future. It was a battle between 2 different Americas, and in many ways, that battle has never truly ended. The same fault lines between science and faith, between urban and rural values, between modernism and tradition, continue to shape American culture and politics to this very day. What do you think? Was the Scopes trial a noble battle for truth, or just a cynical media circus? And are we still fighting the same cultural battles today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this look at a misunderstood moment in American history, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives that go beyond the headlines. Thanks for watching.